Hi, I was running a training course recently and the topic of grief came up. Now, the training course was revolving around dissociation and complex trauma and the understanding of how dissociation really has an effect on many different aspects of the development of the personality, the identity, the ordinary way of functioning in the world. Because so much of it is built around trying to survive trauma, it actually takes away some of the natural processes that we often take for granted in a non-traumatized person. So if we think about this having an effect on the natural development of the self, what can happen is that so much is lost during trauma. And dissociation can really sort of break down the barriers for this. So people often aren't really aware of the amount of trauma they're experiencing during childhood, for example, because the dissociative processes are designed to try and remove the person from the effect of that trauma, which means the losses that are being sustained in the everyday world that that person is in aren't really being grieved properly because the dissociation takes away the grief response. It doesn't remove it entirely. What it does is it kind of hides it or sort of shelves it a little bit. And if we think about it in a slightly different way, everything is being lost during a traumatic childhood. So the ordinary things of life are just not being lost because of the neglect, the abuse, the things that are going on within that childhood. So all of the things that should be being grieved are then not being grieved because of this dissociation that kicks in and kind of just puts a blanket over everything. It can lead to a sort of a numbing effect. So people get very used to losses in life. So they don't really have that kind of grief response. Or they may have had it once or twice and it was simply not able to be experienced properly, or it wasn't looked after. And then inside the brain shelves it once again, hides it because it seems like a pointless thing to get into. Or for some people, it could be a dangerous thing, because a lot of grief involves sadness, and a lot of sadness is not looked after in an abusive or neglectful childhood. So we can think of it then is that the grief process is almost like a continual thing that's taking place during these difficult childhoods, these awful traumatic childhoods. So it's not noticed and it's not really taken care of and it's not done anything with and looked after because it's an ever-present, like it's just something running in the background on a continuum. So that whereas in ordinary life, in a non-traumatized life, a grief response is something that happens in response to a very specific negative event, a loss or a bereavement or some form of abandonment or rejection or whatever it might be. So these things are noticed and the grief reaction comes with it, really forces us to notice it, take account of it, go through the grieving process and ultimately process that grief and that trauma, and that leads us to go on in a non-traumatized way. But if grief is a continual process that's taking place, there's no opportunity of stopping and allowing that grieving process to happen. And I think this is what happens within dissociation, especially within complex trauma, because it's like grief is always there, so therefore it's not noticed because it's just a constant thing. If you get used to this thing happening all the time, you stop paying attention to it, you're not given the opportunity to pay attention to it, and then when you're outside of that traumatic childhood and into adulthood, the ordinary grieving process doesn't naturally just sort of catch up. So what can often happen is that as these really negative events take place later on in life, it can lead to either a complete numbing, i.e. it almost seems like it has no reaction at all, which can lead the person to feel very guilty, or there could be an overreaction to a seemingly insignificant or small loss. So let's say, for example, the loss of an object that might be quite treasured and it's just like left behind on a train. It can lead to an enormous overreaction of grief as the sort of prior grief responses kind of spot a chink in the armor and leak out, and then suddenly there's this huge overwhelm. Now, the double blind of this is that overwhelm can then lead to the person, the dissociation, combining to close it all down, remove it and numb into it. So it's either like a numbing response or it's a huge overreaction that can then lead to a numbing response. Either way, it leaves the person or the system entirely defenseless against the overwhelming nature of trauma and grief. So this is something that really needs to be understood, and within therapeutic settings we talk about grief a lot, and it's something that almost has to be learned to experience. It is a natural human emotion in response to certain types of events, but dissociation sort of like puts a barrier or an obstacle between the person and the system, whatever it might be, and the natural grief response. So it prevents grief from taking place, and that leads the person into difficulty later in life. So in therapy, we put a lot of time and effort into trying understanding the individual nature of grief And then sadly, moving the person towards starting to learn how to have normal and natural grief responses, which can be enormously painful because they're not designed to look after it. They haven't had the skill and the experience to be able to do that. So it has to be done very cautiously, very careful. And this is why whenever we're talking about grief within dissociation and those dissociative barriers are starting to come down, we know that this is much best taken place within therapeutic settings where the person is resourced and supported and their emotional regulation is walked through with the therapist as they're undergoing these grief processes. So I thought it'd be a really interesting just reflection to offer to people because it got raised, and it's something I don't think we've talked about on this channel before. It is an important topic. Needless to say, I'll probably come back to it time and time, or it's just going to be there sort of in different videos, but it's certainly something that people who dissociate really need to take account of. And if there has been no grief experience, it's likely that therapy is going to start introducing grief experiences, and that should be done in a very, very careful and cautious way, which is exactly how we do it here at the CTAD Clinic. So I hope this has been a helpful video. As always, please leave your comments and subscribe to the channel. It's great to have all this wonderful support. It's really appreciated. So please keep watching the videos, and in between now and the next one, do take great care.